Good afternoon, everyone. It's time that I start the first research session, though this is me just testing the format because I'm not really researching anything today. I'm more talking about stuff I already know. So, the thing I want to discuss is encryption because there have been these efforts to infringe upon encryption coming from various places in the last year or so. There is there are actually different efforts depending on where you are, but they're all the same. So the UK has its Online Safety Act. The EU is pushing something else that's similar to chat control, which they've attempted to push before. And the US have various things which may or may not infringe upon it, depending on how you read them and how they're interpreted. So there's a lot of questions going around about the future of encryption, and I kind of just wanted to break some of them down from two stances. So let's get into my white, black, green board. I don't know which color it is at this point. Let's talk about the two sides of it we want to explore. So we want to look at the legality, which we should consider that I am not a lawyer, lockpicking or otherwise. And then I want to talk about the feasibility. And one thing I can say is I am a cybersecurity professional. So I can talk a little bit more about that one. Now, okay, first we have to go through a few things, and I'm going to take a couple of minutes to break down encryption, and how it works, because I think those are topics that people aren't really touching on. They're touching on the EU and the UK and maybe the US trying to destroy them, but they're not really explaining how they work and what it means for people. So we're going to look into this first. I'll make myself some space here. So, encryption is exactly what it sounds like. Back in the 1990s, when the internet was new, the system that people could use to communicate was called HTTP, Hypertext Transfer Protocol, and it essentially tells servers how to communicate with the web browser. The web browser is the thing you're using on a daily basis. And then someone said, hang on, this is in plain text, which means everything that is transmitted can be viewed by someone sitting on the line. So let's say you go to, what was a good website in the 90s, late 90s, maybe Hamster Dance. Wasn't that I seem to remember that, maybe indicating how old I am. But yeah, someone went to a website. I'm going to shrink my text box a bit so that I can illustrate over here. So a user goes to Hamster Dance, and Hamster Dance happily sends back a GIF of a hamster dancing, because that's what the internet was like in the late 90s. Now, the problem that HTTP faced is that a bad guy here could sit between this connection and read everything the user was sending, everything the website was sending back. So encryption became a thing. Not nearly fast enough, but it became a thing when someone invented Secure Socket Layer, otherwise known as SSL. I'm not going to go too deep into how this works because, frankly, we don't need to know. All we need to know is that it enabled the use of the protocol HTTPS, which was an encrypted protocol, which prevented the bad guy from intercepting this traffic. Now, over time, SSL was depreciated and became TLS, which does exactly the same thing, so much so that SSL and TLS are often used interchangeably, even though SSL has been retired and TLS, which is Transport Layer Security, is the new standard. Now, the reason this is good, which I probably shouldn't have to explain to you, is it allows people to operate privately on the internet. Now, if your first instinct is, well, criminals could use that for their advantage, you are probably right. But they're not the only people who use encryption. They're not the only people who want privacy. So these online acts that we're going to get to are trying to, well, actually, let's talk about the online acts later. So privacy has been useful for many years for people like journalists wanting to, I don't know, remain anonymous, not be spied upon, activists to organize their protests. It's useful for any kind of whistleblower, or even survivors of domestic violence. There are, and frankly, these are all like the dark edge cases of privacy. Another person who may want to take advantage of this is you. If you just don't want everything you do to be vulnerable, to be seen by someone else. Now, let's talk a little bit about how it works. I didn't realize I could scroll this infinitely, but I kind of like it. So, how this works, we tend to have something called PKI, which is public key infrastructure. And this is the basic cornerstone of all encryption, in that you generate these things called key pairs. The PKI is actually how you generate them on a scalable level, so I maybe didn't need to talk about that at this point. Key pairs. So if you want to send something in an encrypted way, you generate a private key, which is yours, never shared. And following on that, you generate a public key, which you share to anyone you want to receive your encrypted messages. Then you run a program to encrypt a message with the private key. You send the encrypted message, and then the other person decrypts the message. And this works the same way with a lot of systems that use encryption. So if you go to google.com, when you request Google, it will automatically redirect you to HTTPS, so we know it's encrypted. And along with the initial handshake that starts that connection, Google will actually send you a public key. Now, this public key is there are there's lots of things we could discuss on this public key. So, but what we can actually say is these keys rely on what we call a chain of authentication. So you'll have a CA, which is a certificate authority, which hands down certificates to suppliers. Now, they may have a different chain in the middle, where they'll have a intermediate certificate, and then what I'll call a supplier certificate, because it's what I'm just thinking. I don't know if there's a specific name for that level. But this supplier certificate is the one that you receive a public key for. And the certificate authority basically acts as a cornerstone of trust. And they say that the intermediate certificate is valid, and the intermediate certificate says that the supplier certificate is valid. So you have this chain of authenticity. Now that's how it works when it comes to the web. When it comes to messaging, it's actually exactly the same system. You have person 1 who generates private and public key. Person 2 receives public key from person 1. Then person 2 generates private and public key, because the keys are designed to only go in one direction. And then person 1 receives the public key from... I just managed to fail to spell the word from in 4 different ways. That's kind of impressive. It's only 4 letters. Like, that's a cool failure rate. So person 1 and 2 have now exchanged their public and private, exchanged their public keys. They both have private keys, and they're able to engage in encrypted messaging. Okay, so that's a very basic rundown of encryption. It's very basic because encryption is a complicated topic. It's also a math topic. It's very complex when you get down into it, and we can talk about quantum computing and stuff. I should probably say people smarter than me can talk about quantum computing. I am willing to explain it on this level and maybe go a bit deeper if I need to, but beyond that, it requires someone of a different caliber. Okay. One thing we need to talk about here is exactly what various actors are trying to do. So let's look at the UK's OSA and EU chat control. So chat control is the colloquial name. I forget the exact name of the current law because... well, the EU have actually failed to implement this law before, when the entire population hated the idea, and now they're kind of trying to quietly shift it through again. So this has actually been brought back up since, I think, June or July, when Denmark became occupying the EU presidency. They, on their first day, decided they're going to try and push a bill. And there are various controls in these bills, but the one we're talking about today is the idea that encrypted messages need to be scanned for child sexual abuse materials. And this is an interesting phrasing. The actual phrasing I can pull up from the EU is: this proposal includes the mandatory mass scanning of private communications and aims to break secure encryption by forcing client-side scanning. That's not the wording from the legislation, that's a wording from reporting, but the idea is that when a message is encrypted on the client, it needs to be scanned for problematic material. And obviously, anything we can do to combat child sexual abuse material is a noble goal. No one is going to argue that it isn't. But there's this kind of... well, there's a lot of things we need to... actually, we're going to go into the feasibility section where we're going to discuss a lot of these things. Let's look at legality first. Now, I'm not a lawyer and I don't want to spend much time on this, but I do want to introduce you to one particular document which is quite telling, which is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now, I happen to have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights open here from the United Nations. It's a 14-minute read. And honestly, you should read this document. It's extremely important and maybe doesn't get the... I mean, everyone knows about it, but no one knows what's inside it. And if people knew what's inside it, it would be easier to argue against things like this, because if we look at Article 12, we have right here, no one shall be subjected to arbitrary interference with his privacy, family, home, or correspondence, nor to attacks upon his honor and reputation. Everyone has the right to the protection of the law against such interference or attacks. Now, this phrasing here is critical, because here we have interference with his privacy or correspondence. Now, this is an attack upon both. So anyone who had Denmark commits human rights violation as part of their apocalypse bingo card this year, congratulations, mark that one off, because when we talk about legality, I don't really think we need to go further than this. We have a human rights violation immediately. So we're going to copy Article 12 in there and leave it at that. I'm also going to bold the relevant section. Oops, that didn't go well. Maybe added a bookmark. Clumsy fingers. Does this not have a bold function? It doesn't. So let's put it in. Why? Why would it do that? Okay, I'm still learning to use this tool. We'll figure that out later. Okay, so legality. I think at this point it's very clear that what is being suggested by the UK and the EU and the US is a human rights violation. And while that's not really surprising for the UK, as they've been performing human rights violations in the sake of thought crime for a decade at this point, it is kind of unfortunate when it comes to the EU, who I still hold to a better standard despite all the evidence that I shouldn't. So, legality, we've cleared that section. Let's talk about feasibility, and here's where we can have some fun. Now, the feasibility of this, it requires one thing, which is client-side checks. Now, how a messaging program works is very similar to how the internet works. You have, let's say, person 1, and then you have person 2. And they're exchanging cat videos, because that's all anyone ever uses the internet for. Now, we have a straight line here, but that's not how these things work. This is not how a message is sent. What you will have is you will have server infrastructure. And what this means is that person 1 sends a message addressed to person 2, and person 2 will receive that message when they are online and available. There is no direct connection here. There is a connection to a server and that goes in both directions. Now, what encryption does, and I should say what end-to-end... There are two types of encryption here. We can have it so that the messages are sent with an encrypted protocol, which would be some kind of... I don't know if it counts as TLS, but let's say some kind of private key encryption. And the same here. This is what we call point-to-point encryption. There is no encryption between person 1 and person 2. There is encryption between person 1 and the server and person 2 and the server. What we actually want, and what most messaging apps are now doing, is they are creating what's called end-to-end encryption, which is what we described above, where person 1 and person 2 have exchanged some kind of cryptographic signage, so they're able to discuss with each other. The server infrastructure doesn't store any of this. Well, it shouldn't store any of this. And I'm actually going to make a note here of some messaging services. So we have WhatsApp, which probably stores the keys. Like, I haven't looked into it, but they are Meta-owned, so I don't really trust them. If you want a reason not to trust Meta, look into the 82 terabytes of books they illegally downloaded for their AI efforts, and that's a good place to start. Then there's Telegram. Probably doesn't store keys, but does sell metadata. Now, metadata is not data, and they're not selling data to Meta. Metadata is data about what's happening, but not specifically what is happening. So when we're talking about a messaging protocol, metadata is data about who you're talking to. It doesn't contain the content of the messages, but it contains, you know, who you're in contact with, how frequently, who they're in contact with. And then we have a personal favorite, Signal. Now, Signal is free, open source software, which we'll get back to later. Doesn't sell anything. They live on donations and grants. And they don't store keys. The reason we know they don't store keys is because it is free open source software, which means we can go to github.com and view the source code. We can verify this. So for most of our examples, we're going to be talking about Signal. Now, this is the infrastructure that currently exists in something like Signal. And this raises questions. Like, if we had an infrastructure like the top one, we could see somewhere where messages would be decrypted. It would be on this server. And that has 1,000 problems of its own and will be an absolutely terrible idea. But they want client-side decryption. So what we're looking at on client-side decryption is extremely complicated to do. So if we look at the messaging flow, okay, so you struggle to get text into a box, apparently. As I say, I'm still learning this tool. There we go. So you write a message. One second. Okay, sorry about that. So, you write a message. The message is encrypted. This encryption happens on your device with your locally stored private key. The message is sent. Message reaches the server. Message is sent from server to recipient. Now, this might be a bit inaccurate because the recipient may have to poll the server, so it's not really sending the message. The recipient may be receiving the message, but that's not exactly important for this discussion. So here we have a flow. I have to say that some of these things aren't accurate because in every discussion there'll always be some guy in the comments going, well, actually, and then just adding a tiny bit more specificity, which is one of my favorite parts of the internet. And then we have a step here, which we need to include, where the message is decrypted, and then it can be read. And this is a basic messaging flow. There may be some subtleties in various places that we're not covering. The problem we have with this, I'll move it down so we have a bit more space, is the law requires a check here. Now, it has to happen before the message is encrypted. Now, for this to work, it will need several components. What it will need is logic to scan, and then it needs logic to send to authorities. Now, if this is how this is implemented, you might see how this is problematic. Before your message can be encrypted, there is a potential for it to send to the authorities. Now, how these things work, how they've worked in every case so far, is they being the UK government, the US government, the EU, they have given us this notion that this is to protect children, and by doing so, they cause this moral panic weaponization. Because, of course, people want to protect the children. That's a noble goal, as I've said. The problem is, this is one box. This can happily be, once this logic is in place, this can happily be changed to any arbitrary check. There's no reason this has to be set there. We can quite merrily have any arbitrary check there that we want. Now, I don't know how people feel about their governments, and I think the fact that this came from Denmark is actually kind of tone deaf, because in the Nordic countries have a very low level of corruption. They typically have good trust in their governments to do the right thing. And the fact that Denmark is posting this makes me believe that the Danish government will do the right thing. I don't know if the same can be said for every country in Europe. I don't know if I definitely know that the same cannot be said for the UK. And the idea that a government with a low corruption index like Denmark would not acknowledge the temperature of global politics and see the potential for abuse here is kind of shocking. So let's take an abuse scenario that the arbitrary check is wrong thing. As in, you have a different opinion than that of the prevailing requirement of the day, popularized as a term by the book 1984, which is frighteningly becoming a guide at the moment, it seems. Now you have a wrong think check, which has the ability to send to the local authorities. Now, we only need to look at things like Watergate to understand how surveillance technology, if it can be misused, will be misused. And this is surveillance technology that's it's not designed to check for child sexual abuse materials. That is a front to do what it actually intends to do, which is to break encryption. Encryption has been a thorn in the side of governments for a long time now, because there are bad actors who will use it for terrorism. There are bad actors that will use it for child sexual abuse material. And then there are the mass who will use it to protect their own privacy. Just having a drink. Even robots need to hydrate, so don't forget to drink something. Okay, so we're now in this position where we actually talked about terrorism. So terrorism gives us the opportunity to look into the actual slippery slope effect that can happen with these things, where we have check for terrorism, which becomes check for extremism, and then it starts to blur the line into check for dissidents. And you can see how it starts to snowball from there. The question I would put to you at this point is, how many of you trust your government to check the messages you are writing? I personally wouldn't check my government to check my fridge. I don't trust them. I think there are problems that they have been ignoring for a long time, including, I'm sure you can tell from my accent where I'm from, including a failure to protect children, which has happened in Rotherham for, 15, 20 years, and we keep finding out about cover-ups. So the idea of protecting children is questionable. There's also a further discussion that we need to have. Now, we've seen why it shouldn't be done. Let's talk for a moment about why it won't actually work. And this is actually my favorite part of legislation being written by people who don't understand technology and don't understand how technology works and want to write laws about things they can't. So let's say they have the control in place where they have a check for child sexual abuse materials. Now, this is a check which will presumably run some kind of AI on both text and pictures. So we have a text check, we have a picture check. What this means is there are two avenues for sabotage. First off, there will be keywords that will be tabulated against, whatever system they have. As it needs to run on phones, it needs to run on limited hardware, so they're not going to be able to run extremely complex models. And that actually might be a good way to avoid this, is by downgrading your system, downgrading your phone, downgrading... I became tiny again. Interesting. Downgrading your system so that the procedure designed for it can't actually run. You could also either embed or at the end of your message add a string of keywords designed to specifically flag every message. On the picture check, there are actual movements at the moment to make images impossible for AI to process by embedding pixels in them that cause nonsense. You can actually look, I think it's the AI toaster effect, where someone was I'm having trouble finding that, but basically someone had created a sticker which made every picture scanned look like a toaster. And this is an ongoing, evolving effort to prevent the use of AI to basically steal copyrighted material. But the same principle can be applied. I'm just going to change the color of these so we know they're some kind of activism against these checks. So embedding something that flags the system in a, embedding a false flag so that every message that is ever sent flags this check. And any system designed for actually scanning these things immediately fails. Now, this is the sabotage option, but there's also other options that people can use. One, for example, would be moving up the chain of command by encrypting here. Instead, you encrypt a message outside the messaging system. You use the encrypted output as your message. It is then encrypted again, bypassing every check that has been required by the various government legislations. So, and this is something that anyone can do. This doesn't require special software. It requires a command line tool. Literally anyone can do it. And one thing we can actually kind of entertainingly bring from this is, if you remember, I said Signal was free and open source. And free and open source means a couple of things. Firstly, it means that the software is free. And the free here is free as in speech, not free as in beer, even though it is free as in beer. What it means is that this software is owned by the Signal Corporation. You can go to, I could actually probably pull up the GitHub right now. So you can go to the GitHub here and look at the Signal repository. You can grab the desktop version of Signal. You can look through all of the code. Now, there's this thing about code. This code is all public, which means you can do something called forking it. A fork, as you can see over here, is basically a copy of the code. That's what free and open source means. It means that anyone can make a copy of the code that they then change, alter to their own requirements, and use. Now, let's take a look quickly at how code is implemented. So here I have a code editor. Let's just write in some Python-style pseudocode. So you have code here. You'll have a run function. You have the code broken down into things like functions. So we're defining a function here, and we'll call it. And what we expect this to do is run the messaging program. Then at some point you will have a function which is handily called break encryption. And this will do everything we've discussed so far. So it will check for child sexual abuse materials, report to authorities, and then return. And return just takes it back to the program in question. Now, because the code is editable and forkable, there is literally nothing stopping someone making their own version and going here and just going return. That's it. Now, Signal have repeatedly said, at the point you put return here, none of the rest of this code will execute. Now, Signal have repeatedly said they will leave areas before they actually make this change as suggested by governments, and it's one of the reasons Signal's great and everyone should support them. But they actually can't leave these areas, and that's not saying what they're saying is wrong. What they mean when they say they're leaving these areas is they're going to stop. I could actually switch over and illustrate this so that we have a reference. So Signal is taking a stance. Signal will leave. And that's great. But what that actually means is that Signal will no longer be available on app stores. What it doesn't mean is that you can't download Signal and download it from GitHub. There's absolutely nothing that will stop you doing that. And this is why the bill will actually not change safety in any way. But what it will do is actually make the world a bit more unsafe. Now, you can know if this goes ahead and Signal pull out of the EU and the UK, an official version of Signal will no longer be available for the app stores. This means that a bad actor can fork Signal and distribute Signal. Now, you might ask, this is a good app, so why does it matter that a bad actor would fork it and distribute it? Well, we can actually look at that by going back to our code. Here is our code. You'll see we have this call to a function, report to authorities. Here we have the function. And what this will do is just ping your info to IP, and then it will have an IP address. We'll get into IP addresses another time if anyone's interested in learning about networking. And this will basically ping information to external party. And let's say this is the IP of the police. Again, we have free open source software, so there's nothing stopping someone from commenting this line out so that it doesn't execute, and then changing the IP address to 231. So here we have an IP address of a blackmailer, for example. So someone is able to distribute a version of Signal that is designed to send blackmail material to a person who will then extort a third party. This is the system that is being built. And the fact that this isn't being discussed is actually kind of interesting. It goes back to the fact that people who do not understand technology should not be trying to dictate how technology works. And even if they do, it won't work, because anyone who knows how encryption works can encrypt before it hits the messenger. They can make their own version of it, which has encryption that won't be broken. All they're doing is taking encryption out of the hands of people who don't know any better. It's an attack on people who are in vulnerable situations, who need the encryption but aren't in a position to understand it technically. And that's what's actually happening here. It's not about protecting children, it's about surveillance. Because we can talk about the Electronic Frontier Foundation for a second, and I think that's where we're going to end this. So the EFF, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, are an actual authority on things when it comes to privacy, when it comes to safety online. They're a great resource, so if you know them, you can look them up. And what you should do at this point is just read their article on the idea that the UK's Online Act doesn't make children safer online. And it breaks it down really well. It tells about how the priority is to prevent content that's harmful to children. And then it breaks down all the problems with it. I'm not going to read it all now, but I do recommend this as a place if you want to read more. The EFF are generally a great source of information when it comes to privacy. So yeah, that's all I wanted to talk about today, so I'm going to stop streaming at this point. But if you were with me throughout this, what I hope was educational experience / mild rant, I hope you took something away from it. And if you have any questions, just feel free to hop into my channel and ask them the next time I'm live. I'm happy to explain basically any of these things. Have yourselves a good day.